This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome to today's meeting of the Budget and Performance Committee. Can I ask everyone to please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions? And can I now ask our clerk, Hannah Barlow, if any apologies have been received?
Apologies received from the Chairman and the Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you. And also to note, Assemblymember Bakari is joining us virtually to observe. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? I'm very keen this afternoon. Can I ask the committee to note the ongoing actions from the previous meeting? Noted. And we can now move on to our main item of business, a discussion following the 2025-26 GLA Group Budget with the London Fire Commissioner, and I'd like to welcome our panel of guests. We have Jules Pipe, CBE, who's the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and the Fire Service, Andy Rowe, who is the Commissioner for the London Fire Brigade, and Mushtaq Ahmed, who is the Director of Corporate Services. Welcome and a Happy New Year to you all. The first question is from myself, so I'm going to ask Jules to start first and then move on to the Commissioner. What were the main financial challenges with setting your 25-26 budget?
Well, I mean, the key challenges, obviously, the brigade's been through a difficult recent history, although pleased to say not so recent now, because it's demonstrated it's been able to make sort of huge advances on many fronts, and it's shown that when there is sufficient investment and a real commitment to prioritise what it wants to achieve, it delivers. And the recent HMIC FRS report evidences a real transformation that's happened under Andy and the team, and being judged outstanding in response to major incidents, judged as good in terms of use of resources. I think that's a very positive position to be in with respect to setting this coming year's budget. However, I mean that's the kind of the internal context, I think, for the fire brigade. But then that's got to be seen within the national context, which is difficult for all public services, and that all public services are not feather bedded and having to attempt to live within their budgets. And the fire brigade and the fire service nationally is no different, and the LFB is no different within that national fire context. And so the lack of headroom and the desire to maintain the investment in that transformation, in training, and the absolute unshakable commitment to maintain frontline operational delivery at the levels that we currently have. Addressing all those at the same time, that's the challenge. That's the key challenge, without having that kind of budgetary headroom.
Thank you. And Commissioner, do you have anything to add on financial challenges?
Yeah, so I mean, if we look at sort of the specific external factors that make this challenging, I think persistently high inflation. So obviously that's now forecast to be close to 2%, but has obviously been much higher. If you look at that historically, if you go back to 2010, in real terms, our budget is £150 million smaller than it was in real terms then, if you take into account about £110 million worth of budget reduction and then factor in inflation. So we're already working, like many across the public sector, in reaction to what were the big external factors then around the kind of shock to financial markets, the necessary kind of financial adjustments that had to be made. But we're still working in the context of that era, despite the really excellent investment that colleagues from the GLA have made into LFB to help us change. Increased borrowing costs. That's particularly relevant because I think, from my opinion, there's a problem with the national fire funding formula, the way it works. We're one of the only public sector we're one of the only sectors that don't receive direct capital funding into it. So I've got one of the biggest public sector estates in London, 103 fire stations plus headquarters buildings. Of them, a third are listed, a third are over 60 years old, and yet I receive no direct funding from central government to help maintain that. And that is a significant issue in terms of cost. It means that having used reserves properly and appropriately, it's been judged to have been done so by both the inspectorate and our external auditors over many years to meet that capital programme. We are now caught in a place where those are exhausted and we're having to borrow to fund our capital strategy. So therefore that comes with a increased revenue cost. Tight local government settlement. I mean, that obviously impacts funding from the Mayor. I think it speaks to the point that the Deputy Mayor made, which is it's a very, very challenging macroeconomic environment. We can see that in the pressure on local authorities. We are part of that local authority kind of settlement, really. So we face similar pressure. Actually, the fact that whilst we employ nearly a quarter of the whole-time workforce of whole-time firefighters in England and in fact the UK, we don't decide their pay. That is set nationally. It is negotiated at a national level. So we make judicious assumptions about that in the budget. We don't want to either prejudge that national negotiation process nor artificially impact it before those negotiations have been concluded. You can see year on year we are subject to the outcomes of that. whatever judicious planning we do. And then I think finally it comes back to that local government settlement, and we are in extended discussion with central government around this, as I've been year on year, around the fact that we don't receive any central government funding at all, really. We have very small ring-fence grants in relation to fire safety in particular. But other than that, no. So it's very difficult to kind of sustain your planning because you haven't got any real certainty. You know, the year-on-year budget settlements we've seen repeatedly don't help us. We need a proper settlement within the context of a multi-year comprehensive spending review. So if you to ask me what the financial challenges are, they're predominantly external, really, and they've accumulated over many years.
Okay. And to what extent is the changing demand for the fire brigade services altering your budget and your approach?
Well, I think we'd all recognise that since the terrible tragedy of the Grenfell Tower fire, we've got a different perception of risk in London. You know, we are by a long way the leanest service in a global city of a comparable kind. So I'll give you some metrics. New York, slightly smaller population, actually a much more rigorously regulated built environment, by the way. 11,000 firefighters set against our 5,000. If you go to Paris, smaller population, definitely less complex and less high risk in terms of both call volume and the built environment they're in.
Much lower in height.
Yeah. They've got 8,500 firefighters. I think we've got the right number as it goes. So I'm not here making a plea for more, but I wouldn't want to see any less. So I think in terms of what we've got, we have to maintain it set against the operational assessment of risk that underpins our strategic plan, our statutory duties, the CRMP. So I would say that we're in a changing risk profile that's increasing rather than decreasing. That's mirrored in our call rates. They haven't reduced. We do a lot of prevention work. We do good prevention work. That's been recognised again in inspection. We've got good or examples of national best practice there. You know, we developed the National Charge Safe campaign, which has definitely seen an impact on an emerging threat. But we're surrounded by emerging threats by way of climate, technology, scale, increased population, deprivation. All of these things factored in make it a more complex and higher risk environment rather than less. And I think there's been a tendency in the past to race to the bottom rather than kind of hold the line in what I still think is a world-class service for a world-class city.
I'm going to turn to Assembly Member Hall for the next question.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Andy. And you make some very good points around capital, but we've got a whole section on that. So I'll save my comments to that. You said about the amount of calls that are either the same or going up. There's been a significant increase in false alarms for fires and non-fire incidents over the last decade. So why in particular do you think that is?
I think it's a combination of people having what are effectively commercial alarms in private premises, a greater awareness of kind of connected in alarm systems particularly, and just I think the nature and scale of London. But we've done something directly to address that, importantly. So if you look at our position now on AFAs, I expect to see, automatic fire alarms, I expect to see a very, very significant reduction the next time we bring figures in front of one of the GLA's committees, because of course we've gone to a position that a lot of the rest of the country have adopted, which is we will not go to them unless we get confirmation from a human being that there is actually an incident, because we've got enough evidence that shows that it probably only delays our attendance if we've got a real incident by sort of tens of seconds rather than anything considerable that might generate further risk. There's obvious caveats on that, so where there's really significant life risk like hospitals, you know, we're working with TfL to understand what it means on their estate. But we think that will reduce waste and demand. But I can say now with real confidence that we will fill that with greater regulatory work, because we're seeing unbelievable burden in that space where we need to use firefighters and extend their skills in a different way. We're going to have to meet that demand, and certainly in an increased training offer.
Yeah, well, that's good, because we did the same about a decade ago on lifts, if you recall, stopping the force coming out for lifts that were broken down. What is your response, Andy, to the HMIC FRS, their view that it is not satisfied that the skills allowance for carrying out fire and rescue duties during a marauding terrorist attack is an efficient use of public money?
So,
I was astonished by this.
So the Inspectorate gave us an overall rating of good for our use of resources, which is actually not common across the fire services nationally. So in the overall picture, they've been extremely complimentary in terms of the way we dedicated our resources. And I would suggest that whilst they're entitled to that opinion, absolutely, their inspector, I have the greatest respect for them. They also, in the same report, judged that our response to those incidents is an exemplar of best practice. For me to have that exemplar of what the best sort of response looks like in the country, along with Manchester, we have had to negotiate it because of a failure of national negotiating processes. This should have been part of the structure of national pay and skills required many, many years ago, and speaks to the inadequacies within that negotiating environment. I came to the conclusion, and again I've spoken in previous committees to this, in 2020 when I took over, that whilst there was a completely reasonable debate to be had, and I respect the Inspectorate's view on this, actually the operational need, which is reflected in their kind of judgment on the actual response itself, was greater than the negotiated cost. Why do I think that? Because I'd been at almost every single one of the terror attacks in 2017. I had seen the risk that firefighters were at. I thought it was unacceptable that we had I thought we were failing in our legal duties, by the way. I said this to Sir Tom Windsor previously, that we had people who weren't trained, who didn't have the right equipment, and yet were deploying repeatedly into very high-risk terrorist incidents. For example, we were the first attendants at London Bridge, Westminster Bridge, down into Finsbury Park, and I saw firefighters there in a completely unprotected way whilst we had, a knifeman running amongst them. So that was unacceptable to me in terms of our legal duties and risk. The debate was whether or not we should pay for it. There are some within the National Service who see it as part of the roadmap. We have had contrary legal advice to that actually it's not clear that it's within the contractual arrangements within the Grey Book, and we operated on the basis of that legal advice and sought to negotiate a solution. I would argue that the worth of this has been proved. It's been deployed more than once in London. We've seen some terrible violent incidents where these resources have been used, and what you've got in London now, as in Manchester, is an unbelievable resource that I think, sadly, one day, if we look at, again, that assessment of risk, will have to be used. You've got basically nearly 1,000 people on duty in London who are able to deploy immediately into, a high-hazard area and deal with the worst sort of terrorist attacks. So I have full respect for the debate. I understand where the Inspectorate is coming from, but I'll make no apologies for deciding to seek that agreement with the Fire Brigades Union to ensure we had the operational response in the first instance.
Yep, I agree.
I think at some point it'll get rolled into national pay frameworks. I would greatly like it consolidated into the national pay agreements.
Yep, okay, thank you. I hear and understand. Ms Stark, I hope I pronounced your name properly. What has been the financial impact of the new building safety regime?
Thank you. Clearly, the Commissioner talked about our prevention and protection activities. That's clearly relevant to the regulatory changes. As the Commissioner has already said, we carry a huge amount of risk within London. We have about 70% of all the major high rises in London. So a lot of the time and effort of existing resourcing is focused around tackling from our end some of those risks, but clearly we're only one element of that wider change. Obviously, we get some specific funding from the Home Office for the protection grant, but that is not a major amount. We also supplement that from our own resourcing and making best use of the resources available for that. It is an area in terms of resourcing where we are competing in the market with very limited skills for and war for talent, and we have made some changes to improve the attractiveness of our offer in terms of resourcing, including, for example, issues such as pensions abatement and some market sector specific skills. So in terms of the resourcing impact, it is a high priority for us in terms of when we're setting our own budget and deciding where we prioritise our efforts. But I think it's fair to say the Commissioner and operational colleagues have had a lot of engagement with central government around the wider system and our role in that. And I think the Commissioner would probably want to
if I could, I think it's a key question. It's a very good question, actually. So it's had a significant impact. It's radically altered the kind of operational burden that's upon us. We've been clear with government around that, and they do recognise that it is new burden because it's an effective sea change in the regulatory environment that we're still working through. There is no way of avoiding that. What I would like is that we see a longer-term settlement that is in terms of years rather than single-year settlements, because that would recognise the forward-rolling pressure. I think, to be fair to central government, all the conversations we've had are positive. They recognise that, and I would expect to see that reflected in any future comprehensive spending review and in future central government funding, which I would want as a minimum to be maintained. There's a question beyond finance here as well. There needs to be a significant investment outside the sector into education, because even if you gave me the money, there aren't the people out there to employ. You know, it's a bit like the NHS in that regard. So this is a live issue. It's one of the reasons why we've protected this part of our budget. I see this as operational delivery. So if you don't get this right, then actually you will find it in your response later on. So the cost comes somewhere.
Has it got any better? Because we've been talking about this for quite some time. The ability to get hold of the right people to do this.
Well, we're the largest single education provider in the sector, which tells you something. We've had universities fold courses in because they can't get people qualified to train them. So this is discussion we've had across successive governments around engagement with further education and the Department for Education to get something moving. I think with the publishing of the Grenfell Phase 2 inquiry outcomes, there's going to be a greater focus on this, and I think once again we'll see a bit of energy coming into this, but it needs to happen. This is something that's going to get fixed over years rather than in a year.
Yeah, but it goes on, it rumbles on, and that's the
until
problem.
we get to baseline education, this isn't getting solved.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thanks, Chair. Deputy Mayor, how has the 24-25 overspend been addressed in this budget?
Well, the issue with the overspend is that much of it actually isn't within the brigade's control. Where it has taken action, or where it is, it has taken action. An example of that is, say, overtime, planned overtime. That's been reduced through adjusting the vacancy rate over recent years, and that's having an impact in next year's budget. But there are other factors that are outside of the brigade's control. A significant one of that 8.3 part of that 8.3 million is down to increased pension costs. And that is just an adjustment that we will have to make within the budget and live with that increased cost. We can't reduce that in any way. But I receive quarterly updates on the financial management of the brigade, and we, in this most recent one in December, we discussed the feasibility of bringing forward some of the savings and efficiencies that have been identified in the LFB review. But obviously, we are in the final quarter of this year, so it's unlikely to make an impact.
Thanks, Commissioner.
Perhaps we'll just add some detail to that. So I would expect, if we're talking about the 8 million inside 24-25, I expect us to address that in year. We've already made long kind of headway into it, and I expect to deliver a balanced budget for 24-25. So we'll address it in year. We're not going to roll that over into subsequent years. You know, that would be to kind of worsen the challenge facing us, I think.
It's really clear, thank you. And Deputy Mayor, considering the financial picture that the Commissioner has outlined for the whole of this meeting and the extra challenges for falling debt reserves, the increasing cost of debts and the costly demand of the transformation programme, are you confident that the Mayor's manifesto commitment that there will be no cuts to the LFB frontline and no fire station closures can be delivered?
Yeah, that's absolute.
Great to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Hall, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, just a quick one, if I can. This is to Jules. If the Mayor finds more money for his final budget, which we all know comes almost off a money tree, would increasing the fire budget be one of his priorities? And if not, where will the LFB come in the pecking order?
I want to be helpful, but I'm not privy to what the pecking order would be. But I'm absolutely confident that if we were unsuccessful in identifying any other sources of income, such as an early settlement with the government for this year, as opposed to a settlement for the future 3 years, which I'm more hopeful of, then it would fall to the Mayor to find the money, and I'm confident that he would prioritise this. I mean, as I come back to the answer I gave to Assembly Member Polanski, the frontline operational service of the LFB, it's absolutely sacrosanct and would not be threatened by the budget in any way, and so the Mayor would be determined to find the money.
Well, also, he's sort of tied their hands behind their backs, hasn't he? Because he's said no cuts to the LFB frontline and no fire station closures.
I'm not sure about tying hands, because both
that's where most of the money goes.
The Commissioner and the Mayor and myself are on exactly the same page. That I think that even if a Mayor were to, because it wouldn't be this Mayor, but if another Mayor were to suggest that they would be open to frontline and operational service cuts, I don't think I'm sitting next to a Commissioner who would be willing to implement them.
No, but maybe we'll come to the station element of this in the capital. But thank you. So you'll be shouting loud and clear on behalf of the Fire Brigade when he comes with all this extra money.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. This is a question for Mustak. Is how realistic is the draft budget assumption of a 3% pay award for 25-26?
Thank you for the question. Just to clarify, the base assumption in our budget is for 2%, which kind of matches the kind of government's target inflation rate. And that's always our starting position when we do the November budget. And then, as the Commissioner said, the end outcome is to some extent outside our control, because it's a national negotiation for the opposition workforce. So it's our assumption at the moment. Clearly, the sector as a whole is under financial pressures, so we can't guarantee where the outcome would be on that. I know the Commissioner has been having similar conversations with chiefs of other fire authorities, but it is a prudent planning assumption, but we're also clear in our budget submission that there are risks with that, because we cannot control the end outcome of negotiations. We have been transparent in our budget submission that every 1% increase is worth about 4 million. So that is a clear financial risk which you have highlighted. But I think the Commissioner will probably want to come in, given he's more involved in the wider sectoral negotiations.
So I've made the point. I've made the point now, year on year, that the way the national negotiations run in terms of their timing cycle simply doesn't work for the local government settlement. It seems ridiculous to me that we're beginning to negotiate effectively around a national pay settlement that will land in July now, when we've started setting our budgets really a very long time ago. We started to analyse, do the work around efficiencies. So really, we're very much hamstrung by that process. So we go in with prudent assumptions, knowing that the cycle of national negotiation is completely outside of anything that works, certainly for the GLA planning cycle, but for most local authorities. You know, it simply doesn't work. So what we do is prudent, because what we don't want to do in advance of that negotiation starting is, certainly as one of the largest employers in the sector, adversely and improperly kind of impact what have to be national level negotiations. So we start with what's prudent, but have to caveat that very heavily. I would like to see the national negotiating process and cycle fall in line with the local government budget cycle process, because that would allow discussions to be had at the point people are setting their budget. And therefore, you know, I'm a great believer in transparency. We will be able to come with a much more accurate reflection of what the burden of pay would be likely to be. At this point, I simply don't know. And I've experienced it, you know, in my career in London Fire Brigade, go a number of ways. You can budget for 2 and it ends up as 0. Genuinely, we've had that. Or you can budget for 2 and it ends up at 5. So you can see that there is a challenge with this. And we seek to influence early, but in the end, we have to work to that cycle like every other service in the sector.
Okay, just touching on the negotiations themselves, what stage are we at with the unions on the negotiations?
They haven't started formally.
Not started yet?
No, and again, just to be clear, we're not in the room. I'm not in the room. I am just one. I have one vote, despite being effectively an employer of nearly 25% of the workforce. I have one vote amongst 53 other services, who then feed into a single negotiator who sit with the leadership of the Fire Brigades Union. Now, I think negotiation has served us well, perversely, you might say, having said everything I've said, because it's prevented national fire strikes, which in London are unbelievably costly, damaging, very high risk. So I agree with the principle of national negotiation. I'm not sure that I particularly like independent pay review bodies from what I've seen and the kind of the sort of outfall of that in other sectors and strike action. But I need the process to be rationalised because it would help with everyone in the sector's financial planning. And we are, to be fair, working with the National Joint Council, the Local Government Association, as part of a review into those structures in the cycle to see some rational change on the employer side particularly.
Thank you. Just back to Mustak, if I may. What options does the JLA have for funding any increase, additional increase in pay?
Well, ultimately, when the GLA and the Mayor consider their consolidated budget at group level, they have to make they have options to make choices. Obviously, the Mayor's primary source of income are council tax and business rates, and ultimately it's for the Mayor to obviously prioritise across the range of responsibilities that he has across the group. But those will be the tools for the Mayor to consider.
Okay, thank you. Just one final question for Andy, if I may, Chair. Sorry, this is a bit convoluted, this one. Although a pay increase is generally accepted to be beneficial, it's recognised by the GLA's own guidance that the pay increase based on the percentage increase across all grades does mean that staff on higher grades receive more money than those on lower grades. It's also recognised that a flat increase to all staff would maintain any existing pay gaps between under and overrepresented groups. Do you plan to address this issue in any future pay award discussions?
Yeah, I mean, we do differentiate, actually.
Yeah?
Yes. So if you look at the different skill sets within the brigade, people at different levels, we have different settlements for what we call the top management group. I'll give you a singular example. Directors and commissioner had a pay freeze.
Okay.
At the point we were particularly financially challenged in COVID, but we made sure that that wasn't passed on to those in lower grades because we knew that they were suffering more. So we always take wherever possible within the kind of confines of the contracts and the way we negotiate with the unions, a differentiated approach because we recognise that. And again, if you look at some of the operational agreements, we differentiate between senior officers and between very senior officers, and then those at firefighter and watch level. So it's not just a blanket.
It's not a flat rate. It's
a
nuanced scheme.
It's nuanced, and there are elements with that. Is there anything you'd want to add to that, Mustak?
And just to add, obviously, it also depends on how, for any given level of budget, how the unions, for example, on the non-operational side, we take account of the views of the unions, who sometimes push for a flat percentage. Other times they may not, so that's part of the negotiation as well. In terms of
it's a good question, and we always seek to negotiate on that basis. We're acutely aware that we've got, like all public sector bodies, a wide range of pay, and that the people who are less likely to benefit are the people who pay the least. Yeah. So we always look to that to try and build that into whatever negotiation we're undertaking.
Excellent. That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
Assembly Member Georgiou.
Thank you, Chair. Andy, just going back to the point that you said about the in-year pay increase discussions. I mean, obviously that could be crippling, for you guys financially. If you have one-off year where, as we've had with a lot of local authorities, where a lot of them going bust, we've seen that, so I think the previous year we're looking at 7%, so inflationary pay increases. So just for my understanding, has your colleagues asked as fellow chiefs and commissioners have you already asked previous government, obviously, in this one, can we please start this at the same time as the spending cycle before? Has that ask already been made?
it's not within their gift, to be fair, because this is run through the local government association and through the fire brigades union. It's set within a national structure, so really, in a way, it falls to the LGA, the fire brigades union, and the sector itself to define a better way of doing it. So I would argue that we, as a sector and a union, because it doesn't serve the union well either, by the way. So there is actually broad agreement. We just need to get on with it and do it. So there is a review happening now. It's recognised that it's got to be part of that. Actually, the discussions I've had with very senior union officials, it would suit them better as well, because it's clarity for all, rather than kind of looking backwards, as it were. So my anticipation is actually we'll get there. It's just been too slow. It's taken a long time to get the review started. But it is underway. You know, we've been surveyed. I've had a number of meetings and put our views in, which are as expressed to this committee. And I would expect us to get out the other end of that, I would hope, for the settlement that arises in 26-27.
And off the... Sorry.
I'll just say, unfortunately, it's as you know, it's the same as in local government, that it's always and ever has been retrospective. And you're having to go back and find the money for the...
No, I agree, Mr. Deputy Mayor, but I think it sounds in this instance it's far more convoluted because you're going via the LGA, and so therefore perhaps a question to you: is having obviously the background to all of this, is there a chance for you to go to the government and say perhaps it's better for the LFB that we're not entering into negotiations via the LGA and the FBU outside of the key spending cycle? Because I mean, it just seems like it's not appropriate in moving into the future.
Well, obviously, I agree with the Commissioner. It would be very helpful if we could align it. But as I say, this isn't just a government issue. This is a local government issue in the way that this whole sector, I say not just this whole bit of the public sector, both local government and fire brigades are funded, and so I think it's not just a London issue. So I'm happy to lend my voice to it. But as I say, it wouldn't just be about moving London and London's inconvenience. This is about the whole of the local government settlement process.
No, and perhaps it would shock you to know that I'm not disassociating myself with what you're saying. I think it seems like a proactive step forward, but it just seems something that quite retrograde, and need to move on from it. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I agree.
Thank you. Back to Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you. Question for the Commissioner is: what level of spending on overtime does this budget assume for 25-26, and is it more or less than the current and previous years?
So it's less in terms of what we think we'll actually spend, but we've allocated more in the budget because, and I think, again, this has been recognised by the Inspectorate in terms of giving us a rating for good around resourcing, around the external auditor giving us a rating of, representing value for money across two kind of audit cycles, is that we're just, I think, genuinely more transparent and realistic about the level of spend because we've massively increased the level of training. So a lot of this is not unplanned. This is planned overtime because unless I increase the number of firefighters in the capital, which I don't believe we're in a financial position to do so, I might not want less, but I'm not sure we're in a position to increase the establishment. I have to turn to overtime to manage their necessary withdrawal from frontline duties to train them, which is a clear outfall from the Grenfell Tower inquiry. So I think we get to a position where, if I look at where we were with pre-arranged overtime, in 22-23, we basically had a £12 million overspend outside of the 3.9 odd million we had allocated historically to overtime. Because all big operational organisations needed an element of judicious use of overtime. We'd reduced that to 6 million in 23-24, and we've broadly held that position by bringing it down to 7 million in 24-25, despite the continuous increase in pressure of extended training, because of course we've made a £20 million investment into training that is directly represented in hours spent by firefighters training. That's not something existential, it's a practical reality. They go to Morton in the Marsh, they go and exercise doing counter-terror exercises. They do more leadership training face-to-face, so they're actually taken off duty. That £20 million has a real-life outcome. But despite that pressure, and some fairly extraordinary operational events, again, some of the big incidents you've seen, we've managed to hold that down, and we expect to do better. So how are we planning against it? In each of the next 3 years, we think we're going to spend 6.4 million on operational overtime. Mossadegh can speak to the greater detail about how we're allocating that within the budget now. We know that we have to keep a promise around reducing sickness to, we think, reduce pre-arranged overtime by 3 million. You know, we've come at this more than once. We're going to have to do better. You know, I'm clear about that. It's got to the point where I'm now looking at a list of every single individual who's long-term sick and demanding an understanding of how their case is getting managed. We've got to that level of tactical grip, because where it represents that cost to the organisation, you know, I really can't let that carry on. So that's baked into the plans. We've made that promise within the budget, and I expect to be held to account to that. Is there anything you'd want to add?
Yes, just to confirm, the 7 million of overspend on operational overtime this year, the way we're tackling that going forward is, one is recognising that there is a role for kind of some structural overtime budget that's more realistic than in the past and more efficient level. So we are increasing that budget by 4 million. And the residual 3 million is actually bringing the level of overtime down, building on the previous measures, particularly targeting sickness, where our rates are higher, much higher compared to the pre-COVID period, particularly long-term sickness, because that has a direct impact on overtime. And that's building on all the measures we've already taken. When the Commission mentioned, you know, historically, the overspend was 12 million, we pretty much halved it. That was a result of better operational planning, financial forecasting, looking at how we take a risk-based approach to incidents, addressing skills gaps, addressing the vacancy margin, all those things. It's not one single thing that just impacts overtime. It's all of those things. But the area where we think we particularly need to target next is that kind of level of sickness.
Okay. So can I just clarify for my own understanding? So for the next 3 years, each of the next 3 years, we've got approximately 6.4 million baked into the budget.
Yes. So yes. So we're allocating another 4 million, and then but we had an existing budget. So that's what you've got to.
Excellent. That's fine. Thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you. Assembly Member Mahfouz.
Thank you, Chair. Mossadegh, the question I'm going to ask you just in relation to the transformation programme, so you've got the CMRP, and as we can see, the budget that was submitted is lower than this year's spend and also lower than the original plan for next financial year. Can you talk us through what decision-making has gone through behind that, and if you're looking to defer some of that spending to future years to deliver?
Sure. Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, so I go back to where, for context, go back to the opening remarks from the Commissioner and the Deputy Mayor about the financial kind of context. So in terms of a key part of how we approach this is looking at our priorities. So ultimately, the Community Risk Management Plan, protecting the operational response, our regulatory activities, ensuring we continue our journey of improvement on transformation, but also recognising that we've had a lot of investment. It's not necessarily transformation by its nature doesn't mean you kind of need to continue to invest the same levels year on year. Actually, we should be seeing a return on those previous investments. So we look carefully at all of our programmes and looked at what's kind of vital for next year and what can be rephased, what can be done differently. So, for example, some of our programmes, we know that taking culture, we've absolutely prioritised that. But once you build, for example, a professional standards unit, you don't need to keep on building it, and therefore actually it's about maintaining that, enhancing how it works. So transformation by its nature, we know that the profile can vary. That's different to core BAU expenditure where you need to kind of maintain a certain level. So we've had to make some choices, no doubt. And if we had more money, yes, we could do things faster. But the overriding principle was, what do we need to do to deliver the promise we made to London in our kind of CRMP and continue the investment and improvement that HMRC FRS has recognised, and not kind of compromising on that. But it has led to some choices as well that we've never had to make.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I'd articulate this simply is that you tend to front-load change. So the change that was needed in 2020 laid out before us as a result of the Grenfell Tower inquiry, as a result of catastrophic inspection reports, our own independent review of culture. These were things that had to be addressed as a priority with immediate investment, because otherwise there's going to be a critically poor operational outcome in London at some point. We've delivered that change, thankfully, with the investment that the Mayor's provided, and I'm very grateful for that. And it's evidenced and demonstrated in everything from kind of audit reports to inspection reports and the view of ministerial boards. Doesn't mean we can stop. I think as a big organisation in a city this dynamic, you've got to keep on improving. But where we're at is with a different burden of change from where we were in 2020. This is about maintaining progress rather than having to drive progress across every area of the business. I want to reassure the committee that what we haven't done, though, which has ill-served LFB in the past, is simply, for want of a better phrase, salami slice. So we've, in some areas, increased investment, actually. So if we look at training, we've increased investment. If you look at the Professional Standards Unit, which has done a really good job, despite very significant challenges in setting a far more appropriate standard of behaviour and therefore sanction if you don't meet that, that also gets continued investment. So what we've done is used our CRMP, because it's been done properly, to understand where we still got outstanding areas of risk, where we must continue to still make investment, and then where we could pause and slow, we've done so. And of course, there will be some consequence in that, but it's not critical in the same way.
Thank you for that, and it's really positive to hear that there's already been such a huge impact, and clearly, you've been there yourself in terms of knowing the necessary change that's had to be made, and the pace at which that's had to be delivered. It sounded in both of your answers that there's been a significant return on that investment that's been made. Could you quantify what that is?
I'll give you a practical example. So in 2020, we started the process of changing the way that actually the National Fire Service, so we influenced and effectively wrote new national guidance and operational procedures around high-rise firefighting and evacuation. We then trained across a series of very complex exercises, training events, all of our operational staff, thousands of them. What is the practical outcome of that investment of millions of pounds and time and energy and officer expertise? It's what you see at Dagenham. So we had a major fire in Dagenham where we've got a block of flats that is horrendously dangerous, burning to the ground effectively in under 20 minutes, and yet we've successfully evacuated 100 people from that, multiple rescues, a completely different operational response on the streets of London. So I've always been very, very clear that if we're going to spend taxpayers' money, I need to see a practical outcome at the other end. And we can point to incident after incident where that response has changed. So that would just be one example. I could give you others across regulation, other parts of response. So that is where I would answer the investment has fallen, because it was almost all in direct response to the failings that were identified within the Grenfell Tower inquiry.
I know Assembly Member Clark's going to ask you some more questions about this year's specific spend. Just still looking with sort of one eye to the future, is how close do you feel you are to the point at which you say we've achieved the outcomes that we've set out in the CRMP?
Well, the CRMP runs to 2029, and there's a degree of fluidity to it, because the other thing that was a mistake in the past with LFB is we set a target that was fixed without recognising that risks can change. So if you look at the London Safety Plan I inherited in 2020, which predated Grenfell, but was allowed to exist 2 years beyond the fire itself, it made no recognition of the risk of tall buildings cladding or the lack of effective regulation. So actually what the CRMP does is recognise that we've got to deliver a minimum level against our statutory legal duties, but that has to be informed by a year-on-year assessment of operational risk. So it's a process that's under continuous review. Do I think we're meeting our targets as laid out within the CRMP at this point in time? Yes. As the risk evolves, we have to judge that year on year, though. So at the moment, yeah, we're on track. We're meeting the risk-critical KPIs I would expect. But I wouldn't be complacent enough to think that the pressure's not there, and a city this size, this complex, that might not evolve further in terms of emerging threat by 2029. If you look back 3.5, 4 years ago, I would not have seen necessarily immediately micro-mobility, electric vehicles, alternate storage of energy as a life-critical risk in London. Following the deaths of 13 and 19 people specifically in different instances in continental America. Sadly, the fatalities and injuries we've seen in London, that is, of course, something we now will have to train our entire workforce to meet once the sector has actually developed the technology to respond to it. So it can't be a static thing, but as far as we are at this point in time against the risk we analyse very carefully, I think we're in the right place.
Thank you. Just to take this opportunity to say thank you to yourself and all firefighters for the phenomenal work that you do across the LFP. Thanks.
Thank you. I had the pleasure of actually seeing one of those high-rise training operations in action in my constituency in Kilburn, and glad to hear that it's actually bearing fruit in some of the responses and the example that you gave. Assemblymember Clark.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry for my voice. Andy, how will the Modern Firefighter and Training Program be funded beyond 25-26, given that the Fire Safety Improvement Reserve will mostly have been spent by then?
So we're having positive discussions with both central government and my colleagues in the Greater London Authority around how that's maintained, because it's obvious that beyond 25-26, so into 26-27, there will be a funding gap. I'm absolutely clear as Commissioner that has to be maintained and expanded, because otherwise we do not meet the growing demands of risk, in evolving risk picture, and actually I'm not sure that we completely meet the kind of demands that I think are laid down within the second phase of the Grenfell Tower inquiry. So it has to be maintained as a minimum. I think it probably needs to expand to recognise an ever greater complexity of risk. I think, to be fair, across all of the kind of political colleagues we work with, so this is cross-party, there is a good recognition that that investment particularly needs to be maintained because of the lessons we've all learned, sadly, since Grenfell.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Roberts.
Thank you. Just assuming that funding is made available, can you confirm that the Modern Firefighter Training Programme will continue to be run and utilised by all firefighters and not just senior ranking?
It's not senior ranks, it's everyone.
Everyone
so it
will
already
get
is.
it.
So
Yeah.
we've started...
So they'll continue to be.
It would have to,
be
because so much of this is embedded in practical skills. So whilst the command decision-making is important, if you haven't got people at the other end of that decision-making who have a very good technical understanding of fire behaviour, the dynamics of fire and rescue in what are increasingly complex buildings, then I'm afraid there's very little point to it. It's got to be the whole operational workforce. It's fundamental to their skill set. And it was neglected for many years. Across the whole national fire sector, to be fair. That wasn't just to London, but it's something that must be maintained.
Excellent. Very good to know. Thank you.
Assemblymember Georgiou.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Andy, how do you prioritise your capital programme?
So that's a complex picture because of the size of the estate. So there's a number of factors, both age, listing, obviously the internal and external condition. So to be fair, we've got an excellent head of property. That's where most of the capital programme lies. And she has a very well-considered strategy for use of that capital. So we've got a capital strategy that balances local need against strategic delivery and takes into account everything, from dilapidation through to privacy for all. I mean, I think there's a lot more to add to that. It's a very well-structured approach. It's looking across the risks, sees not to duplicate work, makes most efficient use of contracts, etc.
Yes, so, and it's looking at the whole range of assets that either need maintaining, replacing, or actually investing in modernising in the space of IT and technology. So the Commissioner's right, property is our biggest area. We have 103 fire stations. I'm not sure whether the Commissioner's already mentioned, but 1/3 are over 6 years old. 1/3 are either in listed areas or conservation areas, require appropriate investment maintenance. We have also a capital programme that deals with our fleet and our IT expenditure, and also risk-critical systems. For example, the mobilising system will be coming up for renewal. So our forward capital programme both takes into account essential routine maintenance, replacement and enhancement where there's an operational kind of benefit as well across our whole kind of asset class.
Can I just come in on this as well? I think it's also about learning the lessons from other public sector bodies. So if you look across some of the other emergency service and public sector bodies, part of our consideration is that operational assessment of risk that happens every year is underpinned by really detailed modelling. And, you know, and there is a debate to be had about consolidating fire stations, reducing the size of the estate. Absolutely, but it's marginal gain. And for that marginal gain, you give up your footprint. And where we've seen other emergency services, the London Ambulance Service is a good example where they've completely reversed a decision made to reduce their estate because they realised it left them no contingency in the context of the risks they face. I think we're quite guarded on that, for example. So part of the capital strategy is about looking at future projected population growth, future pressure demand on surfaces, recognising that whilst you can save in the immediacy by reducing your physical footprint, to get it back is actually very, very expensive, particularly in London. So we take a fairly conservative approach to that. I fully recognise there's a debate to be had about that always, but I would argue that, and it goes back to the Deputy Mayor's point, that for the size of service we are in the capital city this is set against global comparators, actually I would be reluctant to change the shape of that estate because it gives me the ability to flex with growing risk. I don't think it's over-engineered, particularly, again, if we look at global and actually national comparators in terms of cost per head of population. So I think in terms of kind of changing operational requirements, the capital strategy recognises that and doesn't just work to the lowest common denominator. I frequently speak to the chief execs, leaders of other blue light and public sector organisations. They frequently tell me privately they wish that some of the decisions that have been made historically hadn't been, and that, you know, they look at LFB actually and recognise why we would have tried to keep the size of the estate we did.
No, and I think you're absolutely right, and I think the Deputy Mayor himself has said that, you know, that the estate as it is pretty much sacrosanct, which I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think I think that's completely right, and I think just let me, and then I'll let you come back in, and I think the Met is definitely one of those organisations that's regretting the shrinking of its estate over time. So with regard to, and I appreciate you may not have the answer to your fingertips, so dilapidation is obviously one of the things. So if we're looking at blue light services, so the Met is, with its current estate, is suffering with, in terms of older buildings. You know, you said a third of your estate is over 60 years old. So in terms of your capital programme, do we have a rough idea of how much is being spent on, you know, making these older buildings sustainable for the future?
Have you got a figure on dilapidation?
Yes. So in broad terms, so if I take kind of next year's kind of capital budget, for example, I can see, for example, within property, if I break it down a bit more, so we've got, you know, we have a minor works budget which deals with, you know, various, for example, health and safety and urgent repairs things. We have sustainability works where we're obviously to meet our carbon net zero targets. We have essential maintenance and replacement of, say, appliance bay doors. We have major refurbishments, part of which is going to be related to HQ. So across those core budgets on property, so major refurbishments next year, 18 million, minor works, 14 million, sustainable works, 10.9 million. So across those areas, we prioritise, as the Commission mentioned, our head of property and the team have a methodology which you know, prioritises based on factors including health and safety, risks, and as well as operational need, as well, and as well as the wider kind of enhancement we're doing, not just to maintain what we have, but to improve what we have. For example, through the Privacy for All programme, which is improving facilities for women, for example. So it's across all of those areas where, in developing our kind of capital plan, we, you know, through the board that I chair, Investment Finance Board, we look at the future projections, both in terms of meeting our health and safety requirements, but also going beyond that and addressing some of the backlogs like dilapidations, as well. So it's a major factor as part of our wider investment in maintaining and enhancing our property estate.
Okay, so Mr Deputy Mayor, sorry, you wanted to come in before.
Just to say that my point was really that the service levels are sacrosanct, and so how that knocks onto the sort of the 103 stations is that the Mayor, the Commissioner, I wouldn't want to see one just kind of lopped off to save money. If there was a proposal to rebuild one of them and it was brought on housing, modernisation and so on, obviously. So it's not preserving it in aspect sacrosanct, but it's the service levels.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. And Mostak, going back to your point, you know, I think where I was going, my question is, and I, once again, because your figures include a whole host of things rather than just saying this is a 60-year-old plus building, this is what we need to do to make it habitable and secure for the future, because there are lots of things that you've outlined that are the nice-to-haves rather than the bare essential requirement, how do we keep this building open, helping save lives in the future. So if possible, writing to the committee, just that very much, you know, making sure those older buildings are fit for the future, excluding the nice-to-haves, but just right, this is how we keep them secure. That'd be very helpful.
Yes, we can do that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Assembly Member Hall.
Can I pick up on this? Because it's something we've discussed, and I discussed with the previous Commissioner. One of the problems, as I see it, is that most of our stations, and as you know, I've been to them all, they're all on the main roads, or they're in prime places. So you could actually get quite a bit of money for that land. And I agree with Jules, not to get rid of the station, but there's so many industrial estates around where you could do a modern purpose-built station where you could have firefighters training through the night, because the noise element wouldn't be a problem as it is at the moment. And you could flex the accommodation for women or not. At the moment, so many of the stations, you're having to find bits to put the women in because they weren't there before. And I understand that. They're very old buildings. And if you look at the cost of keeping these buildings going, and the amount of money that the odd ones, the properties or the spaces would bring, it would massively help our capital situation. So you could keep the Mayor's promises and not get rid of a station. But it makes so much more sense, and some of them are really, I mean, it's just putting patches on them, you know.
So I think you make an entirely valid point, and like the Deputy Mayor said, it's not sacrosanct, so it's not about that station in exactly that place, in exactly that building. It's more about the geographical coverage, maintaining the 6 and 8 response times, and we're genuinely open-minded about this because of the cost actually of maintaining an older estate. What I would say is we do have a divestment strategy. So we look at all of our stations. We try and identify the ones that we could reasonably divest and relocate. You know, we've got some track record in doing that. But it's actually very difficult in London. We found that challenge. We really engaged positively, for example, with the Kerslake review around whether we could develop sites in the context of housing. But what we found is that whilst our estate is very large, the footprint on individual sites is actually quite small. So very often we're not as attractive in the context of the sale price to major developers, because they simply won't get the local planning to build a volume of units on our footprint. We were quite surprised when we started to really unpick it. So,
particularly if it's listed.
Exactly that as well. So I think your point is actually entirely valid. I think it's fair to challenge us on it, and I would expect to have to come back perhaps with more detail around what we've done in terms of a bit of analysis around divestment, whether we can kind of find other solutions for it.
Because industrial estates, isn't Harold Hill on an industrial?
Harold Hill is, and that's an example of where that's worked. I suppose the other point I would make around this is that we would, wherever possible, want to exchange one freehold for another freehold, because we've experienced some challenges around occupying leasehold buildings, both in a headquarters context and in some of our other functions, where you've seen, again, the pressures of inflation, rising costs on rent and service costs, bringing a burden into the service. So, again, where it makes sense,
City Hall as well.
So, you know, where it makes sense to divest yourself of something by a cheaper freehold, absolutely. And I think the challenge is fair. I just think that actually it's a complex piece of work.
It is complex, but it's been going on for so long. and you have got a massive capital issue and the cost of borrowing money to deal with this. It's an ongoing issue because these buildings are so old that it might well be worth it financially to bite the bullet, and even if it's to rent out, and I accept that, and would that we were still paying rent on the proper City Hall, let me tell you. But if you just look, it's a constant drain, and it's not a few thousand quid, it's millions of pounds every year that's got to be funded and borrowed, and then you've got a revenue cost to that capital, investment. I just think that it might be worth really looking at it.
I think we already have in some way, and in fact what I think we should do is include that in part of our written response, because to be fair, our current head of property is very commercially minded. Has come from a commercial background, is interested in making the best use of the estate. So what you're saying is something that she would both recognise and respect. So let's come back with a proper answer about what we've done kind of in terms of depth and where we've looked at it previously and where there might be possible opportunity.
Good. Okay, thank you. Mustaf, are you confident that the planned capital investments in IT will address the areas for the improvement outlined in HM Inspector's report, and that the next inspection will no longer find IT to be an area for improvement?
Thank you for that question. Firstly, I think reading the inspector report as a whole, I think they recognise the improvements already made in that area, and whilst we absolutely recognise it's an area, particularly with technology always changing, where we have to keep on improving. So in terms of the specific question around investments, yes, we are continuing to prioritise. So at the moment, for example, we're in the process of updating our HR and payroll system, as well as our finance and purchasing system, two quite critical systems which support the wider organisation as well. I mentioned earlier the mobilising system. That's a priority for us in our capital programme. It's been prioritised. It's a big investment, quite rightly so, because of the operational risk criticality of that. And the IT department are always kind of looking to improve the technology to support a wider workforce, for example, and the public. For example, the fire survival guidance app, that was an innovation that the department developed. And whilst also recognising, a bit like property, that with IT, you've got to ensure that we are continuing to invest in our core infrastructure, given that the networks and the operational significance of that is really important. So it is an area where we have prioritised our investments and will continue to do so, whilst looking for opportunities to as well, recognising that in some cases technology allows us to be more efficient as well as more effective as well.
Good.
Can I just add to that? So I mean, we've got metrics on that. It's an entirely valid question, because again, of course, there's not a single modern emergency service that doesn't rely heavily on, significant bits of digital architecture. So we invested 3.6 million in 24-25. That's going to increase to 9.1 million in 25-26, taking into account some of the very significant changes we're talking about: replacement mobilising system, finance, purchasing, etc. And then 11.2 million in 26-27. So that's one of the areas, again, where rather than just taking a kind of linear approach to budget cutting, we recognise we have to maintain that investment, because if we fall back, again, I think one of the most critical kind of recommendations that came out of the first phase of the inquiry was the lack of compatibility between emergency services control systems. And that was because emergency services across the whole landscape, health, policing, fire, hadn't invested over decades in, interoperability, proper to digital evolution. We know we can't afford to get caught out in that way again. I think the flip side of that is where we do it well, you'll find savings in spaces outside of IT.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Mustaq, do you have an update on the likely costs of securing a new headquarters? I'm sure we could offer you this building.
So we're still at the feasibility and kind of developing the plan stage. We have done some initial work about the options. A lot will depend on where we go. Our strategy currently is to make the best use of our freehold estate, going back to what the Commissioner says. rather than a rental option, because we have to look at value for money and affordability in the longer term. So whilst upfront capital investment is kind of perhaps more expensive in the short term, over the life of a typical kind of headquarter asset, it should be more value for money. So at the moment, we are looking at options. That includes, one of the options is ATALB embankment. Because obviously,
since what else can be done with it?
Yes, because actually the front site, given that we have exited the development agreement for the wider site, actually now it makes sense to strategically look at the front site as an option, because what we need from our operation is a redeveloped fire station, and if we're going to do that, it might make sense to actually locate the headquarters there at the same time.
We need to stop talking about that damn building. It's been going on for years.
Well, it's still got London Fire Brigade headquarters written on the front of it.
I know.
So
I'm
saving there already.
There is, isn't
on
there?
that very basis,
I'm quite
think
keen
of the money it'd save.
It's all practical common sense, really.
Oh dear. Okay. I think that finishes my questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thanks, Chair. Mustak, how do you plan to address the steady increase in anticipated borrowing costs for capital expenditure?
Yeah, so it is part of the financial challenges outlined at the beginning, because I think LFB has been fortunate in recent times, because we've been able to make use of the historical capital receipts that were banked from previous savings, but those have largely been exhausted now. We're also in a position where we don't have, as the Commissioner mentioned, we don't get direct capital grant funding from central government, unlike other sectors. We do try and bid for where money is available, but for example on SALIX funding for carbon net zero, but they're quite limited. So our core capital programme going forward is based on currently on borrowing. We have factored that into our projections for the medium-term financial plan. And I can see from the numbers, for example, that for this year, we had a budget of 16 million for capital repayments and interest. For next year, that increases to 26 million pounds. That's part of the pressures that the Commissioner talked about, and it's rising in future years. So it's part of our prioritisation. It's something which is unavoidable unless we get funding from central government, which is part of our pitch to the comprehensive spending review for government, as the Commissioner mentioned. But we have to obviously base our current plans on the current methods of borrowing. So it is a pressure which we'll have to factor in, which we are factoring in our financial plans.
Thank you. Earlier on, you mentioned £10.9 million for sustainability projects. Obviously, the LFB have got a large kind of decarbonisation programme. How do you anticipate that money, both for sustainability but more widely for net zero, increasing in capital expenditure each year up until 2030?
So we have been clear that we actually support the Mayor's objective to achieve carbon net zero by 2030, but we have also been transparent that funding is a challenge. So we've estimated, and it's been in this year's carbon budgeting section, as in previous years, that overall we think to achieve fully net zero is about £300 million. 100 million of that is basically projecting forward our current capital programmes, both for fleet and property, where if we're, for example, upgrading boilers, we would go for air source heat pumps, for example, rather than electric. So, but we do have a £200 million gap to fully achieve that. And whilst initiatives like the green finance, which we are taking advantage of, so we are investing, for example, in our electrical infrastructure upgrades, because for EV charging and for also electrification of appliances, etc., we don't necessarily have the capacity in all the stations. So we're doing some of that through the Green Finance Initiative. Ultimately, while that's helpful in terms of subsidising the interest rate, it's still borrowing. So there is only, going back to the wider affordability, we currently doing all we can through our existing capital funding, but there's no getting away from the fact that we do, like other sectors, have a funding gap to fully achieve carbon net zero. And that's a message we've replayed to colleagues in GLA and central government, and we'll continue to make the case for that.
Can I just add something to this, because it goes beyond the sums of money needed, to be fair. There's a complexity to this because the technology doesn't exist for us to green ourselves, just to be clear at this point in time. So we're leading internationally in terms of trying to develop an EV pumping appliance. It's the only one in the world, along with one other newer example now. Neither one of them are particularly operationally resilient enough yet, because it's not the challenge of getting to the instant, it's the challenge of the 5 or 6 hours you're there pumping. No one's come up with the technology yet to solve that, and there's not a big enough market in the same way as electric HGVs to necessarily kind of drive the pace of technological advance you see in other electric vehicles. So we are struggling with that, because actually by 2030, 113 heavy vehicles out of our fleet of 366 vehicles in total will be carbon net zero. So they're big specialist vehicles that simply have to get there but don't pump water. 232 operational vehicles out of 366 will be zero emissions. So that's 63% of the LFC-owned fleet, which is one of the biggest HGV fleets in London. But at the moment, the technology doesn't exist to get to the 150 pumping appliances. So even with the money to put in infrastructure on the fire stations, because it's that electrical infrastructure to charge we really need that's particularly high cost, pardon me, we need a technological solution. We're looking at offsetting that with use of things like biodiesel, biofuels, potentially. That's live now. We're doing a pilot, aren't we, where we're using that across selected locations out of our mass fuel storage tanks.
And I think I'm right in saying that everything under 3.5 tonnes is
Sorry, your mic, Jules.
Yeah, by 25.
But yeah, in this coming year, everything under 3.5 tonnes will be electric.
Yeah.
So there's progress. So of course, it's not just vehicles, though. A big part of it is buildings as well, isn't it? And we're all talking about that already.
Buildings is diminishing margins. You know, we've done a lot of work around sustainability there, whether it's boilers, solar panels, insulation, better windows. We're a long way into that. You know, by 2030, we'll have gone as far as we can within the context of the estate, within existing budgets. So we're not asking for money because we think that's judicious, and we've known about that a long time. I don't think there's an excuse coming for enormous amounts of money there. We're talking about extraordinary new costs set against technology that doesn't yet exist predominantly and directly related to the supply of electricity more than anything. But I mean, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
No, I mean, I think you've said it. You know, in terms of buildings, we're already doing a lot in that space. You know, installing. You know, we've got many stations with heat pumps. We've got renewable solar at 71 stations. You know, LED lighting in most stations. The HVO kind of biodiesel trial is 90% more kind of crop-friendly than diesel, but we recognise it's a stepping stone. It's not the kind of long-term solution. So from existing resourcing, we're doing all we can. We've got a great team that's quite innovative. You know, we've got a building management system that monitors and kind of use of energy, and we've got a carbon literacy kind of education program as well. So we're doing all we can from the resources we have available, but the two big factors, just to sum up, are actually, to fully get there, obviously there's funding gap, and secondly, as the Commissioner has said, there's also, particularly on the fleet side, it's reliant on market developments, which don't fully exist at the moment for high volume kind of pumping appliances, and it's uncertain where that will go in the future.
Thank you. So, Deputy Mayor, can I turn to you then? So, Mustak said we're fully behind net zero, but, and I heard the but, there's a £200 million funding gap. How much of a priority is the carbon budget, and are you confident that by 2030 these can be achieved?
I haven't really got too much to add to what's already been said. I mean, largely that figure is made up of the replacement of the heavy diesel vehicles, and so at the moment, although the 300 million headline figure sounds, obviously sounds large and is large, in reality we are not facing a big chunk of that at the moment because the technology isn't there. Once the technology is there, obviously that is going to trigger that requirement, and then the mayor is going to have to, and the mayor at the time will have to face up to that.
There's a fundamental problem here, isn't it? And it's similar that we have on aviation. If the mayor has a carbon pathway and says this is how we get to net zero by 2030, but then we get to 27, 2028, and he goes, well, the technology doesn't exist. These carbon emissions are effectively baked in, and now we can't reduce those. Then we're not going to get to net zero.
Can I just come in on this? I mean, I think this is tricky because what we're doing is taking a gamble in putting in infrastructure for a technology that might not yet exist. So before we could buy the fleet, we've got to put in effectively substations in multiple locations, because the historic electric supply in all sorts of buildings in London actually was never envisaged to deal with this demand. Now, you might reasonably bet that at some point before 2030 we get to some sort of pumping appliance that can do that. I think we'll get there, but when exactly and how far in advance of that you want to commit very significant building works into operational fire stations and the load onto the grid as part of that is a tricky decision, to be fair. Very specific to this particular service. You know, it's a different challenge in other services. For example, you go to Nottingham, their entire bin lorry fleet will be EV. There's lots of other public sector bodies that really have less excuses in some way because the technology already exists and there's a straight kind of line between what you need to invest, the infrastructure change you need to make, and then what you get at the end of it. With us, we're asking for investment on the basis of something that doesn't yet quite exist. So I think that's quite difficult, you know, to be fair to both Mayor and successive central governments to commit to at this point, although fully recognising why we would want to aspire to that.
Okay, so you're being fair to the Mayor. I want to be fair to you. I don't think you've done anything wrong here. I think this is an ambitious plan. I think the problem is if the Mayor's baking this in and it's not realistic, then we actually need to take the emissions from things we need to take, so reducing traffic, for instance. Now, I realise that's a conversation outside of the scope of this meeting, but I just think we need honesty about the technology that exists and how exactly we're going to get to net zero. And if the technology doesn't exist for the fire brigade currently, then the emissions cuts have got to come from somewhere else. I don't know if you want to respond to that, Jules.
It's not really a budgeting point.
Well, it's a performance point.
I suppose it's beyond the bounds of my... You know, what I can really answer.
Good. I think from a budgeting perspective, what would be interesting for us to get in writing is the changes that are required where you don't feel technology advancement is the issue, and those where it is, obviously, and maybe we can look at it as a committee from there on in writing. Yeah.
It already exists. So I think we can give you our sustainability strategy, which speaks to current delivery, what we've achieved, and what we expect to hold ourselves to. I think that's already there, so that'll be very straightforward for us.
Sure. Assembly Member Georgiou?
For what it's worth, you guys doing a hard enough job trying to keep us safe without having to worry about all this net zero stuff. You know, I think that goes for all the blue light services in London, quite frankly. You've got a hard enough job keeping us safe without having to worry about whether you stick solar panels on a roof or not. Jules, you know, Jules, I know I've upset some of my colleagues over here. Jules, so that £200 million figure, can we get an assurance from you that in future, when these technologies do come online, and I appreciate it won't be under this mayoral term, but if any of it does come online over the next 3.5 years, that these will be capital grants or funded by the mayor or central government rather than having to come out of their bottom line? Because obviously there's already a significant pressure. They're not a revenue-generating outfit, so it won't come from their pocket.
Good question.
I think I can answer the spirit, give you assurance to the spirit of your question, that it's not suddenly going to be sprung on them as a sort of a converting revenue to directly to capital, but as the Commissioner and Mostak have said, over the coming years there will be upgrades, for example, to power supplies because of the huge amount of electric vehicles that are already there, and sometimes that capacity, it will be best to make that capacity sufficient to supply pumping appliances should they be brought forward. If it's a marginal increase in cost when one's upgrading the station. And that will be in the capital programme, and that will be funded by, as Mostak has said, through the revenue contribution to capital borrowing. So to some extent it is already baked into the into the revenue budget in that sense. So I didn't want to infer that it will have zero impact, but there would be no surprises. I'm not. So that's the bit about trying to reassure you in the spirit of it. Yeah. There's not going to be. I think any mayor would be reckless to suddenly say, right, the technology is there, buy the engines, install the supplies, down to your revenue budget to cover that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a completely fair answer. I think, but that also, when we talk about capital, it's not just bricks and mortar, is it? And the thing is, as you upgrade vehicles and all these sorts of things, the problem that you have is that, number one, EV stuff tends to be dearer, can be less reliable, as we know at the moment that it is, and also its lifespan is far shorter than conventional products that we would otherwise use. So I think that's the gist of where I was going. But to be fair, you've given a very fair answer, and you can't commit wholeheartedly at the moment, which I appreciate.
Thank you. And just a final question from me, going back to borrowing costs and future increases or potential increases. It's a question for you, Mostak. Really, can the fire brigade generate sufficient savings to cover any potential future increase in borrowing?
So it is going to be challenging for us. Obviously, we've in our current budget for next year, we've already had to kind of make a number of prioritisation decisions and efficiency savings without, I should caveat, without impacting the front line and our core strategy for as set under the CRMP. But in future, it can be challenging when we have to, obviously, also got other investment ongoing requirements like training that the Commission talked about. That's why, as part of our kind of pitch via the GLA and directly to central government, when the Commission talks about kind of key asks for the comprehensive spend review, one of them is around capital. There is a request from us around, as a sector, having capital grants rather than solely relying on borrowing. We totally recognise that borrowing has a role to play in terms of funding our capital grants, but it is a future pressure that we will have to manage. But it would be helped if we had access to more capital grant funding than we currently do.
Sure.
I think the way I would characterise this is that successive governments, and in particular the Mayor, have helped maintain this blue light service at a level that delivers an appropriate response into London. If you look at us, we've got the best attendance times just about in the world for a global capital city. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be proud of. If you look at what we've practically done that's recognised through external statutory inspection in terms of making best use of public money investment, you've had a profound practical outcome for thousands of residents in some of the highest risk buildings in London. So I think my message really is that we're in a place where these particular efficiencies, they are difficult, but they're appropriate. And because we've driven so much change, they come at a time where we can achieve them. Beyond that, I think there would be a question about whether we were, risking our service in terms of the good standard it provides at the moment. I would like us to hold at that standard. I think we're a good news story in London. I think we're a good emergency service, providing appropriate levels of response into a very complex, high-risk environment. Nothing I've had from central government or the GLA tells me that people want to deviate from that. The discussions I've had with ministers, and I have had discussions with ministers around the budget, with the Mayor directly, is that they all support the direction of travel. And I would hope that is reflected in any future comprehensive spending review rolling into 26, 27 and beyond, because that's really where, we've got to get some certainty across a multi-year settlement.
Thank you. I think that's it in terms of questioning from all of us. I'd like to thank our panel of guests for attending today and for their answers to our questions. And I think maybe on behalf of the committee, thank you for your openness and transparency and candidness really in your responses. The committee has a few more items of business to deal with, but you are welcome to leave the chamber while we deal with those. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Can we also delegate authority to the chair in consultation with group lead members to agree any outputs from this meeting?
Agreed.
Can we note the committee's work programme and meeting dates? And the date of the next meeting, which is tomorrow on the 8th of January at 10 a.m. here in the chamber again. I have no other urgent business today, so that concludes today's meeting.